Episode 4 of the Subjective Professor podcast. In this episode, we're going to go over deconstruction, what it is, and why we may want to consider doing it. So, deconstruction, if you recall, is just simply revealing subjectivity. And we're going to do this by taking apart the constructs, which we talked about in the last episode. It's a kind of reverse engineering of the construction process, and so therefore deconstruction. Now, to review what we've said so far very briefly, people can only take information or perceive subjectively from their perspective. So information is not only produced from a subjective point of view, but we also take information in subjectively. Even if we were all looking at something that is absolutely true, okay, we can only perceive that absolute from our own subjective position. And so we're right back to where we started. So even if someone did discover and wanted to talk about something which is absolutely true, everybody else is still looking and perceiving and trying to understand, critiquing through their own subjectivity. The only way really around this subjective problem or this situation of subjectivity is to have perfect information, to perfect knowledge. And so even if one person were to have perfect information, you're still left with a society filled with many people who are still thinking, perceiving, and thinking subjectively. So the problem that we want to discuss, or the phenomena we're trying to discuss, is this idea of fact, of the truth. And just full disclosure, I mean, personally, on a personal level, I do believe that there are things which are true, but I know very, very well that my truth, what I have chosen to believe as true, conflicts and does not agree with what other people believe is true. So how do we live in a situation where all of us believe that whatever is true is going to be different? So going back to this idea of fact or the truth, when we use terms like this, what we're doing is we're erasing the subject. We try to forget that a person actually created this information, and then that we are going to hear this information subjectively. And so when we use that word fact, we're erasing that entire phenomena, and we're basically saying to people, believe this. And there is no competing information, but we've already talked about that. All information is biased, but when we start talking in terms of fact or the truth, then we're trying to basically forget about the role of the subject in the creation and perception of information. So before we get into the actual deconstruction process, which I'll begin in the next episode, I want to talk about, why we might want to go into deconstruction. All right. First, with deconstruction, we can understand other people better, why it is that they believe what they believe. And I often maintain, especially in the undergraduate situation, a lot of people have been socialized by their public school education. They're not taught really how to think critically. They're instead being taught how to think, what the right answers are, how to jump to the correct conclusion and forget about everything else. So in a situation like that, what people say, or what people give as answers to the questions that I'll raise, not very interesting, because it's usually always the same answer. But what's far more interesting, at least on that level, is to dig into why people will continue to believe the things that they want to believe. And I say that because as you get older, you encounter all this, many different kinds of information, different bits of information. People will continue to maintain what they learned at an earlier age. But the reason the motivation for maintaining this information in the face of better information is very interesting. And in this process, we begin to see the benefits that people receive as a result of maintaining certain information. And I said this before, that we believe what we believe because it's somehow beneficial to us. And doing and engaging in deconstruction allows us to see what those benefits are, or at least be able to sort of surmise or guess what might be the reason that someone will maintain a certain belief. Also, through deconstruction, we can move beyond the simple who's right, who's wrong dynamic. Also, when you go into this who's right, who's wrong kind of dynamic, you start thinking in terms of positives and negatives associated with a certain position or with a certain belief, which is not bad, but it sort of gives people the impression that you have to choose one or the other. Worse still is if you're in that kind of situation and you start saying, let's compromise. I'm not a big fan of compromise unless it's completely unavoidable. But the better option, of course, as I've said before, is to find a third option, an option that is far, far better than the original two positions that were being discussed. Also, through deconstruction, we can diffuse situation. We can crank down the anger and the frustration that a lot of people experience when they're discussing something with someone who, where, you feel like you're talking to a brick wall. Once we are able to crank down that anger, we can avoid going to government. We can avoid trying to legislate what we think is true, what we think is absolutely true, but really is just simply subjective perspective. Many people, when they get into these discussions and they fail to persuade other people to get on board with that perspective, they get frustrated to the point where they engage in political activism so that they can have certain laws passed, which forces everybody else to comply with that subjectivity. So legislation, all it does is reduce choice, and it codifies just one way, turns into law one perspective, and thereby criminalizes all other subjectivities. And so you can see that legislation essentially is coercive. It forces people to comply. It forces people to have to change their subjectivity and adopt someone else's subjectivity. And laws have this unfortunate aspect where it opens the door to punishment. So if you don't agree to a certain subjectivity, you continue to act in the incorrect manner, then you are punished. Now, sometimes I can agree that certain behaviors should be punished. In fact, all behaviors should either be rewarded or punished. But the way that, or the phenomena that arises as a result of legislation is often not very desirable. The drug war would be one example. Immigration as a whole is a mess. And so what would be the solution? Well, before we ask and search what the solution is, we have to understand what the cause of these problems are, of this phenomena that now creates so many problems for us today. And when you start digging, you'll see that it is, you'll always eventually come back to some piece of legislation which now creates a new situation, which is essentially problematic for most people. So the deconstruction also, finally, what it allows us to be able to do is innovate, right? Come up with something different, which departs from what most people would answer or try as a solution. So this is how we find better solutions, right? You are in an argument with someone. How do I resolve this argument? Not by picking a side, choosing a winner, compromising, but by innovating, developing a brand new idea that is far, far better than what people were struggling with before. Now, innovation has characteristics. In other words, not any different new idea is qualified to be called innovation. In other words, innovation has to be an idea that brings more benefit to many more people. In other words, innovation, if it only benefits some people and penalizes a lot of other people, that's not innovation. Also, innovation, which brings a lot of benefit, much more benefit and value to many more people, also has to reduce cost. And cost, and we'll get into this as well when we talk about prices, but cost basically is an indication of waste. The more expensive something is, the potential that there's a lot of waste there is very high. And so if we reduce overall cost, taking into consideration legislation, subsidies, all of these other ways that people try to find funding and reduce their liability. But if we can reduce the overall cost while at the same time bringing far more value and benefit to a greater number of people, that we can kind of see as innovation, the kind of innovation that we desire. And so this innovation can be fostered, or we know that we need innovation when when we come to a barrier, when we come to a point where a lot of people are struggling against each other and you need a better solution. And this will spark innovation. But in order to have innovation, so those are the benefits, why we may want to consider deconstruction. But if we do engage in deconstruction and we realize, oh, I need to come up with a better idea, I need to innovate something better. Well, in order to have that kind of innovation happening in our lives and our society, we need freedom. And so if we're going to have freedom, we have to engage in behavior which preserves this freedom. One of the problems and reasons, actually the main reason why we have so many problems is because people are in this habit, or we've developed this culture where if there's a large kind of situation, phenomena, which a lot of people will call a problem, they'll instantly go to government to ask the government, politicians, to solve the problem for them. But here's the problem. Politicians are people too. If we who are struggling with that problem are not going to be creative to try to come up with a solution, why would politicians engage in that kind of thought process, right? Politicians can only legislate. And as I just said, legislation is coercive and it reduces choices and it standardizes one choice as being the only solution for everyone, and that everyone must comply, otherwise be a criminal. So by preserving freedom, we have more ability, we have more opportunity, more fields that we can explore, which may generate a solution for us. And so, reducing our, instinct or that reaction, that reflex to go to government will help us to preserve our freedom. Also, if we're no longer going to government to resolve our problems, then a lot of this polarization that we see in society, where people are becoming more at odds with each other, where political parties become somehow more important than trying to solve our problems, that whole phenomena becomes reduced, right? It becomes a non-issue, because instead of trying to go to government and criminalizing our political enemies, we're coming up with real solutions. And this is why, this polarizing phenomena is why there's so much emotion. There's just so much anger, frustration in society. So if we remember that if we have more freedom to move, freedom to be able to come up with better solutions, then it would probably bring down some of that emotion, right? Give people the opportunity to solve the problem instead of giving more power to certain politicians to take away our ability to make choices. Deconstruction also will allow us to see how the information works. how people are benefiting from certain information, which contributes a lot to political activism, right? We'll be able to sort of see that, which allows us to be able to see what is propaganda, that is one-sided information sharing, giving you all of the positives, but not telling you anything about the downside risk, the negative aspect of a certain perspective, right? It'll help us to see through marketing, persuasive political speeches, etc. That phenomena. Through our deconstruction, we're able to sort of see past a lot of that stuff. Some people may get offended at this point, oh, this is what you're trying to say. But people who generally get offended that way are generally people who seek to control others. Um, there are a lot of people in society these days who think that they know more than everybody else, and that gives them, therefore, the qualification to control the lives of others, to tell other people how they should be living their lives, and therefore giving themselves that sense of, holiness, or more power, a sense of more entitlement, I guess, the ability to be able to control and tell other people how they should live. A lot of people derive pleasure from this. See, I have the right view. Therefore I'm elected. I have more power than you, and so you have to do what I tell you to do. That's the people who generally get offended. But people who really want to have solutions which make society better, then they kind of embrace this deconstruction approach. There is a sense of liberation or disorientation which comes with deconstruction, and we'll get into that perhaps in the next episode. But remember, all deconstruction is a tool that brings out subjectivity. And if you have this ability to be able to see subjectivity, then you now have the ability to change subjectivity in order to find different kinds of solutions. And this is the process of reconstruction, putting together a better way of living. But again, this is possible and a lot easier to do when we are more free. And so deconstruction, in a way, helps us to stay free. So I'll see you in the next episode, where we will go step by step into the questions we have to ask, the process of deconstruction.